Hello again, everybody. Um, Thus far in the class, we have been talking about what the world of North America looked like before Europeans start showing up. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to begin to intertangle the continents of North America with both Europe and Africa. And you'll see what I'm talking about here in just a minute. But for right now, everybody, there's something that I want to emphasize. And the emphasis is going to be on Europe, and not really in a good way either. If you were a betting person in in the mid 1400s, you would not have bet on Europe to, in short order, become the masters of the world. And what I mean by that is European nations, France, Spain, later on Britain, really carving out these vast European empires and becoming very rich in the process. And the reason why you would not have taken that bet is because Europe was backwards. Politically, it was completely disorganized. It's not going to be until really about 100 years down the road that the rise of what you think of as modern day England will come to fruition. And the French and the Spanish are pretty much in the same boat as well. Militarily, Europe was weak. We have this very Eurocentric understanding of history in the sense that Europe had always imposed its will on groups of people throughout the world. But in fact, during what would become known as the medieval time period, it was Africa that basically imposed its will on Europe, not the other way around. I don't really mean sub-Saharan Africa as much as I mean northern African societies that would raid parts of Europe that whose proximity was very close to the Mediterranean. I'm talking about Italy, and I'm talking about especially Spain, and even to a lesser extent southern France, wreaked havoc on European society. We're talking about a time period where Europe lost close to a third of its population. It was known as the Black Death. You probably call it the bubonic plague. It was eventually an airborne disease that knocked out a massive chunk of Europe's population, and in the process really weakened European life from the inside out. Last but not least, Europe's economy was completely weak. It was nothing like what you think of today, or even the colonial period. Truth be told, the light of the world for the most part was the Middle East. It was those Persian Gulf countries, what would become Iran and Iraq, Turkey. They were really sophisticated societies. It was a region of universities and cities and science and medicine. It was definitely not Europe, and the people of those Middle Eastern societies really looked upon those individuals in what would become Germany and France and Britain as barbarians. And in a lot of ways, Europe was backward. So you really have to ask yourself what in fact happened. Really, there's two things that will happen, and I want to begin with the Renaissance. Some of you have heard of the Renaissance, and I'll give you a very easy way to understand this in a second. But the Renaissance means rebirth, the rebirth of arts, and later on sciences, and more sophisticated ways of understanding the world around you. Renaissance is a French word that does mean rebirth, but really for our purposes, what this means is the rebirth of the ancient Greco-Roman world. When it was Europe, or at least Greece and Rome, that was the light of the world, sophisticated societies. What happened upon the fall of Rome, the Roman Empire that is, was Europe declined into what historians refer to as the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages. It was a very dark, difficult time period in European history. A lot of people like to make fun of this, calling it a 1,000-year period where nobody in Europe took a bath. This is the beginning of the cycle of the Middle Eastern world up and the European world down. So for the next 1,000 years, Europe is going to be a very difficult place to live. And the Renaissance will really begin to change that. What's really beginning to change is a number of different things, and Europe is getting stronger. Part of why Europe is getting stronger is that you do see a 1% increase in temperatures. Now, what I mean by 1% is an average. Over the course of hundreds of years, Europe experienced a 1% average increase in its temperature. But if you were to look at individual years, what it means is Europe is getting warmer and warmer, which of course lends itself to food production. More and more babies are being born, and more of those babies are living on to see adulthood. And when you have more food and you know when your next meal is going to come from, you can do other things like study science, study medicine, study the natural world around you. And what began to happen in what we'll call the Renaissance period is people began to rediscover that ancient Roman world, that ancient Greco world, and they began to really have this cultural sort of renaissance, for lack of a better way of putting it. Now, within that context is an individual from what would later become Italy, a guy by the name of Marco Polo. I'm willing to bet you've heard of that name, but in a very different context. What Marco Polo was a traveler. He was a very talented businessman, but what he liked to do was travel. And in the 1270s, he took a trip to China. Um, Travel was not easy back during that time period. And in order to get to China, the Far East, he had to go through the Middle East. And on his route through the Middle East and South Asia, if you think of India, that's what I'm calling South Asia, and eventually over in the Far East, he was not only interacting with a lot of very unique individuals, but he was bringing back a lot of unique, and I'll even go so far as to call them exotic products, bringing them back to Italy along with him. That sold absolutely fabulously when he got back into Western Europe. I'm talking about things like silk, right? If you think about what most people in Europe are comporting themselves around in, the clothing that they wear, it's wool clothing. You shear the sheep and then you weave the wool into sweaters and other things that don't exactly feel comfortable in the warmer months of summer. If you could go down to your Genoan, silk dealer in Italy and buy your wife, material to make a silk dress, that would make you a very popular guy in your block, if you understand what I'm saying. So silk sold very, very well, and it was brought back by Marco Polo and later some of these Italian travelers. Spices throughout the Middle East. I told you that Europe was backwards, and part of that was its food, its diet was backwards. These are people that are eating foods that are very close to rotten. So if you could take something and throw a little bit of spice on it to dress up the taste, that would go a long, long way when it comes to selling in the marketplace. And of course, you're buying all this stuff from the Italians. So that begs the question, what were all of these other European countries thinking at the same time? And what they were basically thinking is, how do we trade with those Eastern societies? I want to trade with Eastern India. I want to trade with the Chinese, with the Japanese, with those Middle Eastern societies. I want that great stuff as well. The problem is the Italians have a lock on the expressway system. They're not just going to allow you to use the Mediterranean Sea to network your travels. You're going to have to find a different way. One individual that really set up on finding an alternative route to Asia was a guy from the emerging country of Portugal, the western edge of Europe, a guy by the name of Prince Henry. You're looking at Prince Henry on the screen there, and Prince Henry is important for a number of different reasons. First, he established the modern-day country that you think of as Portugal. And by established, I really mean stabilized it, put an end to those northern African raids, and really modernized its political structure. The other thing that he did was modernize the Portuguese economy. And to that end, he established a naval observatory center that he located in the northern country that would come to be known as Algeria, northern African country, that is. Now, it's not a coincidence that he established his observatory there, the study of the seas and the studies of maps. Those Middle Eastern traders, those businessmen that had been doing business in the African part of the world for generations before Europe stabilized, they knew that world like the back of their hand. Why set it up in Lisbon? Those people don't know the African western coast the way that those Middle Eastern traders did. So it's not for no good reason that he set it up in that northern African region. They knew that world much, much better. Now, where he's going with this is he wants to sail down around the coast of Africa and up the eastern coast of Africa to eventually get to South Asia and, in the end, to Eastern Asia, China and Japan, to trade with them the same way that the Italians are. The problem is the Portuguese Navy doesn't know that part of the world, so a lot of this is going to be trial and error, and it's going to be very gradual. But over the course of the next dozen years or so, what the Portuguese Navy will do, largely at the behest of Prince Henry, and much of this information coming from his naval observatory in northern Africa, is inch by inch they are going to navigate the western African coastline, the Atlantic Ocean there, and eventually they will make their way around and they will trade with the Eastern world. In the same way that those Italian city-states had become rich and powerful city-states, Portugal is going to become a rich and powerful country. And in a lot of ways, it's going to serve as an example. If you want to become rich and powerful, a real who's who in European political worlds, then you need to find a way to trade with Asia. And Prince Henry just demonstrated that there's more than one way to skin a cat, so to speak. Okay? So Prince Henry is very important for developing this alternative route to Asia. It's also important that you understand, all the while he's navigating Western Africa, he's also doing business there as well. And initially, this business is going to be mutually beneficial. What I mean by that is there will be products that the Portuguese introduce into Western African life. Many of them are food crops, and at least in the early era, it will be a boon to both Portuguese and African traders as well. Trouble comes when the Portuguese begin introducing the gun trade. Part of what Marco Polo brought back with him to Western Europe was gunpowder, which had been developed in China, which would really be perfected by those European states. And that kind of weaponry had not been seen in Africa. And naturally, African societies desperately wanted to not only trade with those Portuguese businessmen, but they also wanted to be the exclusive trade partner. In other words, I don't want my neighbors, I don't want my rival nations trading with you. I want to lock down this trade with you. Now that begs the question, what is it that those Western African societies have that the Europeans might want? A little bit of low-hanging fruit. It's not for no good reason that you refer to that part of Africa, the central and western part of Africa, as the Gold Coast. A lot of gold there, and naturally the Portuguese wanted that. It's also referred to as the Ivory Coast, parts of it anyway. Ivory was a hot commodity in Western Europe, including Portugal, and Prince Henry wanted that as well. But one of the things that the Portuguese noticed that the Africans dealt in was the institution of slavery. They noticed that Western African kingdoms did practice a form of slavery. A very different form of slavery than what you might be thinking of, but a form of coercive labor all the same. Here's where the Portuguese are going with this. Considerably off the coast of western Portugal is a chain of islands that the Portuguese had actually colonized called the Verde Islands. And one crop that grow really, really well on the Verde Islands would be sugar. Sugar is very profitable, but it's also very labor intensive. You should be able to see where this is headed. What the Portuguese needed was workers that would be very, very cheap and could basically be forced to work in the Verde Islands producing sugar. And that's why they wanted slaves. And so what the Portuguese began to establish is a trading network where these Western African societies would trade for weapons by supplying Portuguese with slaves. Now, the kind of slavery that existed in Africa was very unique in the sense that people that had gone into debt, those were people, in order to work off their debt, they would be considered slaves. There were people that had been condemned by the judicial system and forced into some sort of servitude for a number of different years. But for the most part, you're talking about political prisoners. In other words, your neighborhood got conquered by the guys down the road, and now they're forcing you to work for them as a form of slavery. But probably the most unique aspect, and what set it apart from what would become American versions of slavery, was the fact that it was not infinite, right? that you could actually break out of slavery, that it had a finite term to it. It wasn't a slave for life, as Frederick Douglass would later famously say. The other important aspect about Western African slavery is that you did not hand that condition down to the next generation. When you had a child, that child was not automatically born a slave. That's very different than the kind of slavery that would be practiced in the Americas, largely at the behest of Western European countries like the Portuguese, Spanish, and eventually British. But in any case, what Africa had to give to the Portuguese was slaves. Now, if you think about slaves, this is not something that you can just go out there and manufacture the same way that you can with guns or pottery or something like that. Slaves had to be conquered. Again, the prisoners were generally, prisoners of war that is, were generally the most well-represented group of people that could loosely be called a slave in Western Africa. And so what the Portuguese are going to indirectly touch off is a series of vicious civil wars in West Central Africa that will really serve to weaken Africa. And by the time that the 19th century rolls around, and France and Britain and even Germany begin to carve up the African continent, it had suffered close to 300 years of civil wars and had been systemically weakened really from the inside out. And this slave trade is a very important aspect of that weakening. Okay? So you're beginning to see Europe and Africa becoming more and more intertwined during this time period. There's another European nation that I need you to be aware of, and it actually doesn't exist during this time period. It's going to be a collection of kingdoms. And what would come out of the marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon, a Spanish kingdom, to Isabella of Castile is going to be the modern-day nation that you call Spain. Much like any other Western European society, Spain, before it was really Spain, was backwards and weak and, pretty much exploited part of the world. That would change with Ferdinand's marriage to Isabella, which would consolidate those two Spanish kingdoms and produce the modern-day Spain that you think of today. But what Ferdinand and Isabella probably would deserve more credit for would be the modernization of the Spanish economy. And to that end, what they did was they hired the services of an Italian voyager, a ship captain by the name of Christopher Columbus, who had this crazy idea. Probably not what you're thinking of, but a crazy idea all the same. His idea was to sail west to get east. In other words, an alternative route to Asia. The Portuguese had a lock on the Western African route. Columbus wanted to see if he could sail to the west and eventually arrive in the east, on the idea that the earth was in fact round. Now, the craziness was not the idea that the earth was round. Ferdinand and Isabella were two very well-educated Spanish monarchs. They had been tutored and schooled in the finest Spanish schools, and this idea in the ancient Greco world that the earth was round, that was not rocket science. That was pretty much common knowledge to the elites of European society. What was radical was that nobody was crazy enough to actually try this, because who knows what's out there? Who knows how big the Atlantic Ocean in fact is? Who knows when you're going to get to where you want to go, which is ultimately the east. So Columbus is given this shot, and Ferdinand and Isabella kind of roll their eyes and say, well, what do we really have to lose? They gave him 3 rickety old boats, the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria. They provided the labor force, much of whom was criminal, that would serve as Columbus's crew. And they said, you know what, Columbus, knock yourself out. If you think that you can do this, then we're behind you on this, and we will give you your shot. Columbus predicted, approximated, you will, that this trip was going to take him maybe 2 weeks. It took months and months, and his crew actually was threatening to mutiny on him, throw him overboard, and that was about the same time that they bumped into an island that Columbus would later christen San Salvador. Right? He's in the middle of the Caribbean Sea. He thinks he's off the coast of mainland Japan. Actually, he thinks he's off the coast of India. So naturally, when these native people came to him, greeted him with trinkets and other things, he naturally dubbed them Indians. Thought that he was off the coast of India. So naturally, why wouldn't these people be Indians? Obviously, this is an entirely different civilization. He's nowhere near where he thinks he is. But to his dying day, Columbus would go to his grave assuming that he had discovered an alternative route to Asia. What Columbus began doing very quickly is sending products back to Madrid for Ferdinand and Isabella to sample. He began to send sketches of not only the landscape, but also the people that inhabited the lands that he had bumped into. And eventually he began to send Native Americans, Indians, back to Spain as slaves, as proof that he had found the East. Now, once again, we're talking about very well-educated, elite Spanish monarchs, and they're like, Columbus, I don't know where you are, but you're nowhere where you think you are. But they also understood a very good thing when they saw one. And while maybe they're not in Asia, they are in a place that could make Spain a very powerful and a very rich nation in short order. So what Columbus's voyage touched off was a mass frenzy of what would become known as conquistadors. You've got people that are voyaging out trying to see exactly what it was that Columbus had bumped into, and these are expeditions that are really serving two purposes. Number one, sizing up the Americas, and number two, kind of conquering, the Spanish are conquering every single thing that they come upon. As a matter of fact, one Spanish conquistador famously said, I'm paraphrasing him, of course, but my goal was to not leave an island unconquered. Every place I went, my goal was to conquer it and deliver it to Spain. You've got a conquistador by the name of Ponce de Leon that is going up and down the peninsula that you call Florida. What's he looking for? Well, obviously gold, treasure, all that good stuff, but in particular, the Fountain of Youth. There is this European fascination with the exoticies of the Western Hemisphere, and the idea that this thing called the Fountain of Youth existed, it drove those fantasies. So you've got De Leon that's doing his thing in Florida, and if you think about Florida and exactly what demographic of Americans live in Florida today, it's kind of funny, it's ironic considering he's kind of barking up the wrong tree. A lot of elderly people living in Florida, and here Ponce de Leon is looking for the Fountain of Youth. You've got Vasquez Nunez de Balboa, who is going up and down the isthmus of the central part of the Americas, and ultimately he's going to be the first European to lay eyes on the Pacific Ocean. As a matter of fact, it's going to be Balboa that dubs it the Pacific Ocean because he considered it to be so much more peaceful than the Atlantic Ocean, its counterpart. But for our purposes, it's really going to be Hernan Cortez, a Spanish military official, that is going to be the most important of these conquistadors. In 1519, Cortez was stationed in what would become the island of Cuba. And the Spanish government will commission him to lead an expedition, a conquest of the Mesoamerican interior. Now, this conquest is really going to ebb and flow. And he's going to leave Cuba with approximately 500 conquistadors, Spanish warriors. And initially, he is going to be very well received by the indigenous inhabitants of mainland Mesoamerica. There are a number of different reasons why. Number one, the Aztec calendar did emphasize that there would be this point in time where white gods would come, and this would be a glorious occasion. So here come the Spanish with their white complexions, with their facial hair, which had not been seen in the Western Hemisphere, with their glittering, shiny armor, with their magical weapons where they would pull a trigger and a guy 50 yards down the way would just drop dead. These have got to be the gods that the Aztec calendar are talking about. And initially, when the Spanish were ushered into Tenochtitlan, they were greeted quite favorably. But over the course of time, it becomes pretty clear what they're there for. They're not there for any sort of celebration. They're there for conquest. And the Aztecs pretty much chased them out of the capital city. And Cortez rather was very lucky to get out with his own skin, and then he really got lucky. If you recall from a few lectures ago, I had made mention that there were some civilizations that the Aztecs actually left unconquered so that they could draw upon them for human sacrifices and tribute. And obviously, these people did not like living under the Aztec rule, and here come the Spanish who had this common enemy. And so a translator, who would later go on to become Cortez's mistress, a woman by the name of Malinali, native woman, would become fluent in the Spanish language. And she would serve as Cortez's translator, and she would tell these conquered groups what you ought to do is team up with the Spanish and go fight the Aztecs to set you free. And that's essentially what ends up happening. Historians feel that the Spanish were successful really for three reasons. Number one, they had superior military technology, not only guns and cannon, but also animals that had not been seen in the Western Hemisphere. Of course, you have the horse, but also the dog. They were vicious animals that the natives had never seen and were terrified by. So military technology is one of many reasons why they think that they were successful. The other is Native American allies. As I just got done pointing out, the Spanish are going to grow rapidly from their 500 conquistadors, and had it not been for those Native American allies that had been conquered by the Aztecs that wanted to return the favor, so to speak, there's a chance that Cortez might not have been as successful as he was. But the really critical element of the conquest of the Aztecs does involve what I'll call Pax Americana. If you recall, one of the earliest lectures of this class demonstrated that the Americas had been cut off from the rest of the world for the better part of 3,000 years. And the immune systems that would develop in the Americas would be very different than the immune systems that would develop in Europe and Africa. What would be a very common illness in Europe would be absolutely devastating to Native Americans who had never been exposed to that sort of thing. Now, in particular, what I'm talking about is really smallpox, to a lesser extent mumps and measles, but these not only devastated Native Americans because their immune system was just not equipped to handle it, but they spread like wildfire. Now, initially, the Spanish don't really understand this. They understand that the natives seem to be getting sick, and that's helping them achieve victory. They don't entirely know why. Over the course of time, however, they're going to be able to put two and two together. There are stories of the Spanish purposefully infecting blankets and other articles of clothing and then disseminating them amongst Native Americans, knowing good and well that that would infect them, get them sick, and help their purposes of conquest. And so if you've ever wondered why there's so much uproar as to whether or not we ought to be celebrating, glorifying Columbus through Columbus Day, a lot of this is what they're talking about. In certain locations of Mesoamerica, we see a decline in the population, a dying off of the population of over 90%. 90% of a population dying off through these old world European diseases. That's why a lot of people believe that what Columbus brought with him, whether he knew it or not, was essentially genocide, and we ought not, as Americans, we ought not to maybe be glorifying this whole process. Right? But after that initial devastating effect of Pax Americana wears off, I think you can make the case that there is a mutually beneficial exchange that will begin to kind of emanate here. What historians call this exchange is something called the Columbian Exchange. It's an exchange of goods, it's an exchange of people, and it's also an exchange of ideas. And this is going to happen from 1492, and to some extent it's still happening as we speak, this Columbian exchange of goods, of people, and of ideas, right? For our purposes right now, the goods are probably the most important dynamic here. There are things that the Europeans are going to bring with them that will completely reinvent life in the Americas. Maybe the most important thing that would really reinvent life for Native Americans would be the horse. Now, not only had the horse gone extinct in the Western Hemisphere, the kind of horse that was indigenous, the ancient horse if you will, it was much smaller. The Spanish are bringing horses, and these horses are really going to transform life for these indigenous people. And if you think about groups like the Sioux in the Dakotas and Wyoming, or if you think of people like the Comanche in the Southwest, they're going to become excellent, excellent horsemen. And in a lot of ways, Sioux life, Comanche life, really will revolve around the horse. They will bring food crops with them. If you think about the Western European diet, bread is kind of important. And so it'll be wheat that will come over and really, really thrive in the Western Hemisphere. I mean, it really is hard to not think of wheat or other grain crops growing in places like Kansas and Nebraska, arguably the most fertile region for producing crops in the world. Livestock, cattle, swine, various other domesticated animals that would serve as food sources, they come over to the Americas and would obviously go on to become important economic commodities in addition to reinventing life in the Americas. What's coming out of the Americas from the Columbian Exchange is probably even more important. American food crops. Think of the tomato. Now apply that to Italian food. I mean, think about all these Italian dishes that really thrive on the tomato crop. Think about the potato. Really, all across Northern Europe, from Ireland to Scandinavia on into Russia, the potato is a huge part, a very staple part of the European diet. But the big one is corn, maize, which obviously grew real well in the Americas, but was not seen nor tasted in the European world. And so those American crops, especially corn going over into the old world, they are going to fuel a population explosion. Today, it's really difficult to think about those massive populations throughout the Eastern Hemisphere not being able to survive without those American crops, especially corn. But this population explosion is also going to be important when it comes to understanding how and why it was Europeans that came to dominate the world and its economy in the process, because there's just so many more of them. The Columbian Exchange is a really important part of this. Now, the two other ideas here, or excuse me, the two other dynamics that are part of this Columbian Exchange, one, people. You're going to see not only Native Americans sent over to the Old World, you're going to see more and more Europeans coming over. And once that native population gives out in terms of a labor force, first the Portuguese, then the Spanish, and eventually the British are going to begin bringing Africans in the form of slaves to the New World with them. So you're not only seeing Europe becoming more and more intertwined with North America, you're also seeing Africa, Europe, and North America becoming increasingly intertwined. So people are a part of this as well. And then, of course, ideas. Not only religions, but also ways of organizing political societies. Democracy is a part of this. In an earlier mention, in an earlier lecture, I had mentioned what a big impression the Iroquois League made on European colonists, the French and the British. Democracy will really be exchanged. Christianity, one of the things that the Spanish are trying to do is Christianize the indigenous people of the Americas. As a matter of fact, there's a very important group of Catholic leaders that will come over to do exactly that. But in any case, what the Spanish have just spelled out is this is a way to become a rich and powerful country. Once all of those American crops and American commodities, including gold, once it began to come back over into Madrid, much like Portugal with the trade to the east, what it did is it made Spain a very rich and consequently a very powerful nation. And you don't have to be a political scientist to understand that both the French and other Northern European, Western European societies are really going to be quick to scramble to try to follow suit. And so in our next lecture, we're going to find out that this Spanish success in the New World is going to touch off a frenzy of Western European countries that are coming over here in an attempt to colonize the New World. First the French, and eventually the Dutch and English as well. What you're also going to find out is that it's not a one-size-fits-all. Our popular impulse is to assume that the way that the English did things was certainly the way that the French and the Spanish and the Dutch and everybody else that was over here operating was the way that they did that as well. That's in fact not going to be the case, but we're going to have to pick that up in another lecture. For right now, that's where we're going to stop.